Give it back. 30 students went silent. Grayson Whitfield looked at the woman standing in front of him. Plain blazer, quiet voice. A new professor nobody had bothered to learn anything about yet. Or what? He said. He threw the notebook on the floor. She bent down to pick it up. Then he shoved her, hard. And when she turned back around, his hand came up and connected with the side of her face. The sound of it filled the whole room. Nobody breathed. She just stood there, one hand on her cheek, 5 full seconds. No tears, no shouting, nothing they expected from her. Then she lowered her hand and spoke, calm as still water. I don't look for trouble, but I don't run from it either. What that boy didn't know, what nobody in that town knew, was that the woman he'd just slapped had spent 12 years serving alongside Navy SEALs, and she never forgot a promise.
There are people who walk into a room and get judged in 3 seconds flat. Most of the time, that judgment is wrong. This is a story about one of those people. A woman who looked soft, who spoke softly, who smiled at strangers like she had nothing to prove. She had plenty to prove. She just never felt the need to prove it to people who didn't deserve the truth. Her name was Vivian Calder. She was 30 years old, and on a cold September morning, she drove into a small town called Millbrook with everything she owned packed into the back of an old Ford. She didn't know yet that Millbrook was about to test her, not with bullets, not with danger in the way she used to know it, with something quieter, something meaner, the kind of cruelty that hides behind good manners and polite smiles. Stay with me, because what happens in this town will remind you of something important. Sometimes the strongest people in the room are the ones nobody bothers to look at twice, and sometimes the people we underestimate the most are the ones already carrying the weight of protecting others long before anyone asks them to. This story is not about revenge. Keep that in mind as we go. It is about something older than revenge, something steadier, a kind of quiet dignity that refuses to disappear no matter how many times the world tries to slap it down. You will meet a young man who believes power is something you simply inherit. You will meet a father who believes money can buy silence forever. And you will meet a handful of ordinary people who slowly find the courage to stop looking away. But mostly you will meet Vivian. Let's begin where she did, on the road into a town that had no idea what was about to arrive on its doorstep. Millbrook College sat on a hill at the edge of town, red brick buildings, old oak trees, a clock tower that hadn't kept accurate time since the Reagan administration. It was a small school, 2,000 students, give or take, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody's business by lunchtime, and everybody knew the Whitfield name. Preston Whitfield sat on the board of trustees. His family had funded half the campus. His name was on a library wing and a science building and a scholarship fund that mostly seemed to help kids who already had enough. His son Grayson was a freshman, 19 years old, broad shoulders, easy smile, the kind of young man who had never once heard the word no and meant it. Vivian didn't know any of this when she signed her contract. She just knew the history department needed an adjunct professor. American history, 2 sections, nothing complicated. She needed quiet. She needed a town where nobody asked too many questions. Millbrook seemed perfect for that. She was wrong. But not in the way most people are wrong. She spent her first weekend in Millbrook unpacking slowly, no rush, no boxes stacked against the wall for weeks the way some people leave them. She hung her clothes. She set up a small kitchen table by the window. She placed exactly 3 photographs on the shelf above her bed, none of them recent, all of them handled with the kind of care that told you each one mattered more than its size suggested. On Sunday morning, she walked into town. Millbrook had one main street, a hardware store, a diner with a faded red awning, a church with white paint peeling near the steeple. She sat at the counter of the diner and ordered coffee, black, and a plate of eggs she barely touched. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired, kind eyes, asked if she was new in town.
"Starting at the college Monday," Vivian said. "History."
"Well, welcome to Millbrook," the waitress said. "Nothing much happens here. Folks like it that way." Vivian smiled and thanked her. She didn't say what she was thinking. Nothing much happening was exactly what she'd hoped for. She'd learned soon enough that peace Real peace doesn't come from a place. It comes from what a person is willing to stand up for no matter where they land. Millbrook was about to teach her that lesson all over again, whether she was ready for it or not. Driving back from the diner that first Sunday, she took the long way past the college just to see it in daylight without the pressure of a first day looming over her. The campus looked peaceful enough from the road, students tossing a football on the quad, a groundskeeper trimming hedges along the front walk. An ordinary place doing ordinary things. She'd learned over 12 years not to trust ordinary too quickly. Not because ordinary was always hiding something, most of the time it wasn't, but often enough that a person in her line of work learned to look twice anyway, out of habit more than suspicion. She parked for a moment near the front gate and simply watched. Nothing seemed out of place, no warning in the air, nothing her instincts flagged as dangerous. Still, something about the quiet made her pause. Some towns wore their secrets loudly, arguments spilling out onto porches, tension you could read on faces at the grocery store. Millbrook wore its secrets differently, politely. Underneath a layer of good manners thick enough that most visitors would never think to look beneath it. She started the car again and drove home, telling herself it was nothing, just a new town settling itself into her mind the way every new place did, before she understood its actual shape. She would understand Millbrook's shape soon enough, better than she ever wanted to. Her first morning she got to campus early. She always did, old habits, the kind that don't wash out no matter how many years pass. She walked the halls before the students arrived, checked the exits, counted the doors, noticed which windows opened and which ones didn't. She didn't do it because she expected trouble. She did it because her body did it without asking permission. 12 years will do that to a person. By the time students started filing into room 214, Vivian was already standing at the front, arms loose at her sides, watching them come in, the way a person watches weather roll across a field. Calm, patient, paying attention to details other people miss. Most of them barely looked at her. New professor, youngish face, plain blazer, plain blouse, hair pulled back, simple. Nothing about her screamed anything. That was the point. Grayson Whitfield walked in 11 minutes late. He didn't apologize. He didn't even slow down. He dropped into a chair in the back row, boots up on the desk in front of him, and pulled out his phone like the room existed for his convenience. Vivian kept teaching. She didn't call him out, not yet. She'd learned a long time ago that the first mistake usually isn't the one that matters. It's the second one, the one that shows you who a person really is. For a brief moment, watching him settle in with that careless confidence, her mind slipped somewhere else entirely. She remembered a compound overseas, years ago now, a young local girl sitting silent in a corner of a makeshift clinic, refusing to speak to anyone in uniform. Vivian had been the one they sent in, not with weapons drawn, with patience. With a willingness to sit on the floor for 2 hours, saying nothing until the girl finally looked up and decided to trust her. That was the work nobody back home ever understood. Not the missions people imagined from movies. The quiet ones. The ones that required you to read a room, read a person, and know exactly when to wait instead of push. She blinked, and she was back in room 214, watching a 19-year-old boy scroll through his phone like the world owed him its full attention. Different room, different stakes, same basic skill. She got her second mistake within the hour. There was a girl 2 rows in front of Grayson, small frame, dark hair, the kind of quiet that comes from years of trying not to be noticed. Her name was Josephine Bellamy. Everyone called her Jo. Jo raised her hand twice that class period, both times before Vivian could call on her. Grayson made a comment. Low enough that a less careful person might have missed it. Not low enough that Vivian did. The first comment made 2 boys near him laugh. The second comment made Jo put her hand down and stare at her notebook for the rest of the class. Vivian noticed. She always noticed. She said nothing that day. She just filed it away the way she'd been trained to file away things that mattered. Grayson didn't act alone. He never had to. He had 2 friends who followed him everywhere, laughing at the right moments, backing him up without ever being asked directly. A wiry, restless boy named Marcus, and a heavy-set, quieter one named Cole. Boys who had learned somewhere along the way that standing next to power felt a lot like having power of your own. Neither of them started the cruelty. They just made sure it never ran out of an audience. Vivian watched that too. She'd seen this shape before, in different uniforms, in different rooms. A person doesn't become cruel entirely on their own. Somebody usually claps for it first. By the second week, the pattern was clear. Grayson wasn't cruel in big, obvious strokes. He was cruel in small ones. A shoulder bump in the hallway, a comment about someone's clothes, a joke that wasn't really a joke, told loud enough for the whole cafeteria to hear. Jo took the worst of it. Nobody was entirely sure why. Maybe because she never fought back. Maybe because Grayson had decided somewhere in his careless 19-year-old mind that some people existed to be used for entertainment. Vivian watched all of it, quietly, carefully. She wasn't the only adult who noticed. Professor Eleanor Voss, who had taught biology at Millbrook for almost 30 years, noticed too. She'd seen boys like Grayson before. She'd also seen what happened when nobody stopped them in time. "You're new here," Eleanor told Vivian one afternoon over bad coffee in the faculty lounge. "Let me save you some trouble. That boy's father sits on the board. Nobody touches him. Not the dean, not campus security, nobody." "Somebody should," Vivian said. Eleanor gave her a long look, the kind older women give younger women when they're deciding whether to trust them with something true. "Somebody should have a long time ago," Eleanor said. "It didn't work out well for the last person who tried." "What happened to them?" Vivian asked. Eleanor's face changed. Something older and sadder crossed it just for a moment. "His name was Arthur Lowry," she said. "Taught economics here for almost 20 years. Good man. Fair grader, fairer heart. He raised some questions about how certain scholarship funds were being spent, funds with the Whitfield name attached. And within 6 months he was gone," Eleanor said. "Official story was budget cuts. Everybody on this campus knew better. Nobody said a word out loud because saying it out loud has a way of ending careers around here." Vivian sat with that for a moment. "Where is he now?" she asked. "This Arthur Lowry." "Left town, far as I know," Eleanor said. "Broke the man's heart what happened. He loved this place, loved these students." She shook her head slowly. "You want my advice, Professor? Be careful how loud you get. This town has a short memory for the people who get pushed out and a very long memory for the family that does the pushing." Vivian filed that away too. She had a feeling she'd be coming back to it. She had no idea, sitting in that faculty lounge with a cooling cup of bad coffee, exactly how soon that feeling would prove her right. The incident that changed everything happened on a Thursday. Vivian would remember the date for the rest of her life, though she'd never say so out loud. Some dates just carve themselves into a person. This was one of them. Class had been going fine. They were deep into a discussion about the early years of the country, about the cost of standing up for something when everyone around you tells you to sit back down. It was in hindsight a strange thing to be teaching on a day like that. Grayson had been quiet for once. Vivian should have known that meant something was coming. Halfway through the period, Jo dropped her notebook. It slid off her desk and landed near Grayson's feet. He picked it up. For 1 second, it looked like a kind gesture. Then he opened it, scanned a page out loud in a mocking voice, some private note Jo had written to herself, something small and personal that was never meant for an audience. The class laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Jo's face went white. She reached for the notebook. Grayson held it just out of reach, grinning. "Give it back," Vivian said, calm. Even, not a request. Grayson looked at her like he was noticing her for the first time. "Or what?" he said. It wasn't really a question. It was a test. Vivian had taken 100 tests like it before, in places far more dangerous than a college classroom. She walked over. She held out her hand. "The notebook," she said. "Now." For a second, something flickered across Grayson's face. Maybe hesitation, maybe the tiniest flash of doubt. Then his father's name did what it always did. It reminded him he'd never faced a consequence in his life that actually stuck. He tossed the notebook onto the floor instead of into her hand. It landed, open pages bent. Vivian bent to pick it up.
That was when he shoved her. Not hard enough to be an accident, hard enough to send her stumbling into the desk beside her, hard enough that half the room gasped. She caught herself, straightened, and in the half-second it took her to turn back around, Grayson's hand came up and connected with the side of her face. The sound of it filled the whole room. For a moment, nobody breathed. Here's something you should understand about a moment like that. Most people expect a scene. Shouting, chaos, someone crying, someone yelling, campus security sprinting down the hall. That's not what happened. Vivian stood there, one hand pressed lightly to her cheek, and she didn't move for almost 5 full seconds. 5 seconds doesn't sound like much. In that room, it felt like an hour. Every student watched her, waiting to see what she would do, waiting for the tears or the anger or the collapse they half expected from someone they'd written off as soft. None of that came. She lowered her hand, her eyes were dry. Her voice, when it came, was steady in a way that made the room go even quieter. "I don't look for trouble," she said, "but I don't run from it either." That was it. That was the whole thing she said. She picked up Joe's notebook from the floor, smoothed the bent pages with 2 fingers, and set it gently back on Joe's desk. Then she looked at Grayson. Not with rage, with something colder, something that made the boy shift in his seat for the first time since he'd walked into that room.
"Sit down,"
she said. He sat down. Nobody in that room could have told you exactly why. It wasn't fear of punishment. Grayson Whitfield had never feared punishment a day in his life. It was something in her voice, something underneath the calm that told every single person in that classroom this woman had faced far worse than a 19-year-old with a chip on his shoulder. And she had walked away from it standing tall. There was a young man near the window that day, a quiet sophomore named Peter, sitting where he usually sat, close enough to see everything clearly. He'd pulled out his phone during the commotion, instinct more than plan, and recorded almost 11 seconds of the aftermath before slipping it back into his pocket. He didn't tell anyone he had it. Not yet. He wasn't sure why he'd even done it. Peter wasn't a brave young man, not by his own estimation. He'd spent most of his life avoiding conflict, staying quiet in the back of rooms, letting louder people decide what mattered. He wasn't sure why this moment had felt different. Maybe it was the way Vivian had stood there afterward, not broken, not begging for sympathy, just steady. Something about that steadiness had made him want for once in his life to have something real to offer, if it ever came down to it. He saved the video in a folder buried 3 layers deep in his phone. He told himself it was nothing, just in case. Sometimes just in case is where courage starts. Quiet, unsure, hidden 3 folders deep, waiting for the moment it's finally needed. Word of what happened moved through Millbrook College faster than anyone could have predicted. By lunch, half the school had heard some version of the story. By the end of the day, most of the details had been twisted, softened, or exaggerated, depending on who was telling it and who they were trying to protect. In the cafeteria, one version claimed Vivian had provoked Grayson first. Another claimed she'd fallen on her own and made up the rest. A few students, the ones who had actually been in the room, tried to correct the record and found themselves quietly talked over by classmates who had already decided which story was safer to believe. That was how it worked in a town like Millbrook. Not through lies, exactly, through a slow, comfortable drift away from anything inconvenient. Vivian noticed the shift in the hallways over the following days. Some students wouldn't meet her eyes anymore. Others went out of their way to smile at her a little too brightly, the way people smile at someone they feel sorry for but don't want to get involved with. She didn't take it personally. She'd seen this before, too. Communities protecting their own comfort long before they protected the truth. It didn't shake her resolve. If anything, it clarified it. Vivian went straight to the dean's office that same afternoon. Dean Robert Ashcombe had run Millbrook College for 11 years. He was a tired-looking man with kind eyes and a spine that had gone soft somewhere around year 6. He listened to Vivian's account. He nodded in the right places. He made sympathetic sounds. Then he told her something that made her understand exactly what kind of town she'd landed in. "I'll speak with Grayson," he said, quietly. "I'm sure this can be handled without involving the board."
"He struck me," Vivian said, "in front of 30 students."
"I understand that's serious," the dean said in the tone of a man who did not, in fact, understand how serious it was. "But you have to understand our position. The Whitfield family has been very generous to this institution, very generous." "So generosity buys a pass for assault?" Vivian said. It wasn't a question either. The dean's face tightened.
"That's not what I'm saying."
It's exactly what you're saying, Vivian said. You're just saying it politely.
She left his office without raising her voice, without slamming a single door, but something in her had shifted. Quietly. The way a tide shifts before anyone notices the water climbing higher up the sand. Preston Whitfield heard about the incident that same afternoon from the dean himself over a phone call that lasted less than 4 minutes. He didn't call his son. He didn't ask if Vivian was hurt. He asked one question and one question only. "Is this going to be a problem for the fall gala?" The dean assured him it would not be. Preston thanked him, said something about looking forward to seeing the new science wing groundbreaking move forward on schedule, and hung up. That was the entire extent of his concern. He didn't think of Vivian Calder again for the rest of the day. In his mind, she was already a settled matter, a minor inconvenience absorbed and dismissed the way his family had absorbed and dismissed minor inconveniences for 3 generations running. He had no idea, sitting in his office that afternoon, that he had just made the first real mistake of his life. That evening, at the Whitfield house on the north edge of town, Grayson came down for dinner like it was any other night. His father sat at the head of the table, reading something on his phone, barely looking up. "Heard you had an incident today," Preston said, not unkindly, more like he was commenting on the weather. Grayson shrugged. "New professor tried to embarrass me in front of everyone. I handled it." "Handled it," Preston repeated, a faint smile touching his mouth. "That's one word for it." "She's not going to make a thing of it," Grayson said. "Ashcombe already told me it's taken care of." "Good," Preston said, setting down his phone at last, looking at his son with an expression that was almost pride. "This family didn't build what it built by apologizing for every little thing. Remember that." Grayson nodded, the words settling into him the way they always did, another small brick added to a wall he'd been building his whole life without ever choosing to build it. A wall made of the belief that consequences were things that happened to other people. Neither father nor son mentioned Vivian's name again that night. In their minds, the matter was already closed. They had no way of knowing that somewhere across town, in a quiet apartment with a worn leather notebook on the table, the matter was only just beginning. That evening, Eleanor Voss found Vivian in the empty history department, grading papers under a single desk lamp. "I heard," Eleanor said, settling into the chair across from her. "The whole campus heard. I'm sure they did." "You could press charges," Eleanor said. "Legally, that's assault." "I know what it is," Vivian said. "Are you going to—" Vivian set down her pen. For a long moment, she looked out the window at the dark campus, at the lights still burning in a few scattered dorm windows.
Not yet,
She said finally. Eleanor frowned.
Why not? Because right now this is about me, Vivian said. One professor, one bad kid. Easy to sweep under the rug, easy to make disappear if I push too hard too fast. I've seen how that goes. So what are you going to do instead?
Vivian was quiet for a moment.
"I'm going to wait," she said, "and I'm going to watch. Boys like that don't stop at one mistake. They get bolder, they get careless, and when they finally go too far, I want there to be more than just my word against his."
Eleanor studied her for a long moment. There was something in the way Vivian said it, something practiced, something that came from more than just common sense. "You talk like someone who's done this before," Eleanor said carefully. Waited, watched, built a case before making the move. Vivian almost smiled. Almost.
Let's just say I've had some practice with patience, she said.
She didn't explain further. Eleanor didn't push.
But she left that night with a strange, unshakable feeling that there was a lot more to the quiet, new history professor than anyone at Millbrook College understood yet. Before Eleanor left, she paused at the doorway.
"Can I tell you something?" she said. 30 years I've taught here. I've watched a lot of young people come through this campus. Some of them arrive kind and leave kind. Some arrive kind and leave believing kindness is weakness. "What made the difference?" Vivian asked. "Somebody willing to show them otherwise," Eleanor said.
At the right moment, before it was too late to matter. She smiled a little sadly and gathered her coat.
"I think you might be that somebody for a few people on this campus," she said. "Whether you meant to be or not."
Vivian thought about that long after Eleanor had gone, about Joe, about Peter, about all the quiet people on this campus who had learned to expect nothing from the adults meant to protect them. Teaching history, she'd always believed, was never really about dates and names. It was about showing people that ordinary human beings, faced with an unfair world, had a choice in how they responded to it. She hadn't expected to be teaching that lesson quite so literally, quite so soon. But she supposed that was how the most important lessons usually arrived. Uninvited, inconvenient, exactly when they were needed most. 3 days passed. On the surface, nothing much happened. Grayson avoided Vivian's classroom for exactly 1 day, then walked back in like nothing had occurred, sitting in his usual back row seat with the same easy confidence. Nobody from the administration ever formally addressed the slap. No meeting was called. No letter was sent home. If Preston Whitfield knew what his son had done, he showed no sign of concern. Vivian kept teaching, kept watching, kept quietly checking on Joe Bellamy between classes, making sure the girl knew she had somewhere safe to go if things got worse. "You don't have to do that," Joe told her one afternoon, hovering by the classroom door after everyone else had left. "Look out for me. It's not your job." "It's not about job descriptions," Vivian said. "It's about doing the right thing when you're in a position to do it." Joe looked down at her shoes. "Nobody's ever really stood up for me before. Not like that." "Then it's about time somebody did," Vivian said. Joe hesitated, then sat down in the chair across from her like something had loosened enough for her to stay a moment longer. "I live with my grandfather," Joe said quietly. "My parents aren't really in the picture. He raised me, mostly. He used to teach, actually, a long time ago." "Here, in Millbrook?" "For a while," Joe said. "He doesn't talk about it much. Left teaching before I was even born. I think something happened, but he's never told me the whole story." She shrugged a small, tired motion. "He just says some places don't deserve the good people they push out." Vivian went very still for a moment. Something about the phrase settled into her chest and stayed there. "He sounds like a wise man," she said carefully. "He is," Joe said, and for the first time something like a real smile touched her face. "You kind of remind me of him, actually. The way you don't back down." He used to say that too, quietly, but he never backed down. "What's his name?" Vivian asked. "Your grandfather." "Arthur," Joe said. "Arthur Lowry. Everyone in town used to know him. Now half of them pretend they don't remember." Vivian kept her face calm, though something inside her had gone very still. "He sounds like someone worth knowing," she said. "He is," Joe said again, quieter this time. "I just wish more people saw it. I wish this town remembered the good ones as easily as it forgets them." Vivian reached over and gave the girl's hand a brief, steady squeeze. "Some things take time to be remembered properly," she said. "Sometimes they need someone willing to remind everyone." Joe looked at her for a long moment like she was hearing something underneath the words she couldn't quite name yet. Neither of them said anything more about it that day. But something had been planted in that small classroom, quiet and patient, waiting for the right season to grow. The following Monday, Millbrook College ran an unannounced emergency drill. Fire alarms weren't unusual on a campus that size. Most of the time they were false alarms, some student burning popcorn in a dorm kitchen, some overly sensitive sensor in an old building. This one was different. Real, smoke thin but visible, curling out from a maintenance closet near the science wing. A frayed wire, as it turned out later. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to trigger genuine panic in a building full of students who had never actually seen smoke in a hallway before. Vivian was 2 doors down when the alarm went off. Something in her changed instantly. Anyone watching closely would have seen it. The shift from relaxed to alert happened in less than a second, so smooth it barely looked like a shift at all. She moved into the hallway before most people had even processed what the alarm meant. "Everyone out this way," she said, her voice carrying without her raising it, cutting cleanly through the rising noise of confused students. "Leave your bags, move calmly, do not run." Students who had spent weeks barely noticing her suddenly found themselves listening without quite understanding why. She checked doorways as she moved, counted heads without seeming to count at all, redirected 2 students who'd started heading toward a stairwell filling with smoke, guiding them instead toward the clear exit on the opposite end of the hall. A young woman near the back of the group had started hyperventilating, panic taking hold faster than her legs could carry her toward the exit. Vivian crouched beside her without breaking stride from managing the rest of the hallway, one hand steady on the girl's shoulder. "Look at me," Vivian said. "Not the smoke. Me. Breathe in for 4. Hold it. Now out." The girl did, once, twice. By the 3rd breath, her legs remembered how to move. Vivian walked her the rest of the way out, personally matching her pace, talking low and even the whole time about nothing in particular. The weather, the smell of coffee from the dining hall, anything to keep the girl's mind from spinning back into panic. When a young man tripped and went down hard near the science wing doors, panic building around him as other students nearly trampled past, Vivian was there before campus security even arrived. She had him back on his feet and moving within seconds, her hands steady, her voice low and certain in his ear. "You're fine. Up you go. Keep moving. Almost there." It was such a small thing, that steady voice repeated to 2 frightened strangers. Nobody would remember it as heroic, but it was the kind of small thing that had kept people alive in rooms far more dangerous than a smoky college hallway. By the time the fire department confirmed there was no real danger, every student from that wing was standing safely on the lawn outside, accounted for, calm, despite the chaos of 10 minutes earlier. Nobody had been hurt. Not one person. Walter Higgins had been Millbrook College's head of campus security for almost 15 years. Before that, he'd spent 22 years in the United States Navy. He didn't talk about it much. Most people on campus knew him as the quiet, gray-haired man who checked IDs at the gate and walked the grounds at night with a flashlight and a limp he never explained. Walter had seen a lot of people react to danger over the years. Panic, freeze, overreact. Every kind of response a human body could produce when adrenaline hit hard and fast. What he watched Vivian Calder do that morning was none of those things. It was something else entirely. Something he recognized in his bones before his conscious mind caught up. The way she moved through that smoke-filled hallway wasn't panic, and it wasn't performance. It was procedure. Trained, practiced, second-nature procedure. The kind that only gets built one way, through years of doing it for real in places where a mistake meant somebody didn't come home. He found her afterward, standing near the edge of the lawn, checking in quietly with a shaken freshman before letting the girl go find her friends. "You've had training," Walter said, "not a question." Vivian turned. For a moment, something guarded crossed her face there, and gone so fast most people would have missed it. "Everyone should know basic safety procedures," she said lightly. Walter almost smiled. "I've worked security 15 years. I've seen basic safety procedures. What you just did wasn't that." She didn't answer right away. "Where'd you serve?" he asked, quieter now, just between the 2 of them. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Around them, students were slowly filing back toward the buildings, the drill already fading into ordinary campus gossip. "That's a longer conversation," she said finally. "For another day." Walter nodded slowly. He didn't push. Men who'd served understood better than most when a door was being left open instead of shut. "Fair enough," he said. "But for what it's worth, ma'am, I know what I saw today. And I know what I saw last week when that Whitfield boy put his hands on you." Something tightened in Vivian's jaw.
You saw that?
Word travels fast on a small campus, Walter said, and I make it my business to notice things. Comes with the job. Comes with the years before the job, too. He held her gaze for a moment, steady, respectful, nothing pushy in it. You didn't hit him back? Walter said. Most folks with any real training in them, they'd have needed real discipline not to. That tells me something about who you are. Vivian looked out at the campus, at the students milling around the lawn in the last of the morning light, laughing now that the scare had passed already, forgetting how close things might have gone differently. I've learned that some fights aren't won with your hands, she said quietly. Some fights you win by staying standing when everybody expects you to fall. Walter studied her a moment longer. Then he gave her a small, respectful nod, the kind one professional gives another when they recognize something familiar in a stranger. Well, he said, if you ever need someone in your corner on this campus, ma'am, you've got one. I mean that. He paused halfway, turned, and looked back at her once more. Can I ask you something else? Walter said, off the record. Go ahead. That boy, Whitfield, you planning on letting this go? Vivian considered the question carefully before answering. No, she said. I'm planning on being patient. There's a difference. Walter nodded slowly, like that was exactly the answer he'd hoped for. Good, he said, because I've watched that family operate on this campus for 15 years. They don't stop on their own. Somebody has to make them stop. Usually costs that somebody a great deal to try. I'm aware of the risk, Vivian said. I figured you would be, Walter said. Folks who've done what you've done, they usually understand risk better than the rest of us. He tipped his head toward her, respectful, almost formal. For what it's worth, ma'am, this town could use somebody like you, whether it knows it yet or not. He turned and walked off toward the science building, already back to his rounds, already looking every bit the quiet, gray-haired security guard nobody paid much attention to. Vivian watched him go. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel in this town. Not quite safety. She'd learned a long time ago not to trust that feeling too easily. But something close to it. Something like the first thread of an ally in a place that was about to need every ally it could find. That night, Vivian sat alone in her small rented apartment on the edge of town, a single lamp burning low beside her chair. On the table in front of her sat an old leather notebook, its cover worn soft and dark from years of handling. She hadn't opened it in months. She opened it now. Inside, her own handwriting filled page after page, cramped and hurried in some places, careful and deliberate in others. Notes from another life. Names of people she'd served beside. A few phrases in a language most of her students had never heard spoken. Tucked into the inside back cover, wrapped carefully in a small square of faded cloth, sat a medal she hadn't looked at in a long time. She didn't take it out that night. She just let her fingers rest against the cloth for a moment, feeling the small weight of it beneath her hand. 12 years, she thought. 12 years of a life most people in this town would never understand, wrapped up small enough to fit in the back of one worn notebook. She thought about Grayson Whitfield's hand connecting with her face, about the silence in that classroom afterward, about Joe Bellamy's white-knuckled grip on her own notebook and the flicker of hope in the girl's eyes when someone had finally stood between her and the people who hurt her. She thought about Walter Higgins, recognizing something in her that most people missed entirely. She thought, too, about something an old commanding officer had told her once, years ago, in a place far from here. He'd said that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the choice to protect someone else even when you're afraid. She hadn't been afraid that day in room 214. Not really. But she understood, sitting alone with her notebook and her quiet apartment and the sound of Millbrook settling into night outside her window, that the fight ahead of her would take a different kind of courage than the kind she'd trained for. This wasn't a battlefield. There would be no clear enemy lines, no orders barked over a radio, no clean answer about who to trust. There would just be a town full of ordinary people, some brave, some frightened, some simply tired, all of them slowly deciding whether to look away or to finally stand up. She thought about Joe and the grandfather the girl barely understood, a man who had once refused to stay silent and paid for it dearly. She thought about Eleanor, carrying a decade of guilt for watching it happen and doing nothing. She thought about Walter quietly offering an alliance without asking a single question he didn't need answered yet. Healing a town like this one, she realized, wasn't so different from healing after everything she'd survived overseas. It didn't happen all at once. It happened one honest conversation at a time, one small act of courage at a time, until enough small things added up to something nobody could ignore anymore. Maybe that was the real lesson underneath everything else. Not that the strong protect the weak, though that mattered too, but that dignity, real dignity, is something you keep giving away freely, even when the world seems determined to punish you for it. She closed her eyes for a moment, let the weight of the day settle, and allowed herself just this once to feel something like. She closed the notebook gently, set it back on the table. Some places, she thought, you fight with everything you've got right away all at once. Other places, you wait, you watch, you let the people causing harm show everyone exactly who they are in their own time, in their own words, until there's no denying it left for anyone to hide behind. Millbrook was the second kind of place. She could feel it already, the same way she used to feel a shift in the wind before a storm rolled in. Whatever was coming for this town, whatever the Whitfield family had built here on money and silence and fear, it was going to take more than one quiet moment in a classroom to bring it down. But she had time. She had patience. And she had 12 years of training that had taught her the most important lesson of all. The loudest person in the room is rarely the strongest one. Sometimes the strongest person is the one everybody underestimates right up until the moment they can't afford to anymore. Outside her window, Millbrook settled into another quiet evening, the college lights dimming one building at a time. The town, believing for now that everything remained exactly as ordinary as it had always been.
It wouldn't stay that way for long.
Somewhere across town, a father tucked his phone away for the night, satisfied a minor problem had already been solved. A boy fell asleep, believing he'd gotten away with something small, and a girl lay awake a little longer than usual thinking about a professor who had looked her in the eye and meant every word of a promise she didn't yet fully understand. None of them knew it yet, but the quiet, ordinary shape of Millbrook had already begun slowly and patiently to shift. Some shifts start with an earthquake, others start with something as small as a woman deciding quietly not to run. This one had already started. Millbrook just hadn't noticed yet. Soon enough it would. Some promises get made out loud in front of witnesses, sealed with a handshake everyone remembers. Others get made quietly, in the dark, beside someone who is running out of time. Vivian Calder had made a promise like that once, years ago, in a place far from Millbrook, far from college campuses and faculty lounges and quiet Sunday mornings at a diner counter. She hadn't broken that promise. Yet. Not once in all the years since. She had no intention of starting now. Promises like that don't fade with time. If anything, they grow heavier. They settle into a person, the way certain grief does, quiet most days, present, every day, waiting for the moment life finally asks you to prove you meant what you said. Vivian had carried hers across an ocean, through a discharge, through years of small towns and temporary jobs, always half looking for a place that felt like the right place to finally set it down. She hadn't known Millbrook was that place, not at first. She was about to find out. What she didn't fully understand yet, sitting in her small apartment with Joe's words still echoing in her mind, was how close she already stood to keeping it. Arthur Lowry. That name had just walked back into her life, carried on the voice of a 19-year-old girl who had no idea what it meant. Vivian was about to find out just how small this town really was. The next morning she found Walter Higgins near the gate before classes started, a thermos of coffee in his hand, watching the sunrise the way men who've spent years standing guard tend to watch things. carefully, like the quiet never fully stops being earned. "Morning, Professor," he said.
"Morning," Vivian said. "Got a minute?"
Walter nodded toward a bench near the flagpole. They sat.
"I want to ask you something," Vivian said, "and I want an honest answer, not a careful one."
"Go ahead."
"You said you'd seen training like mine before. What exactly did you see?"
Walter was quiet for a moment, considering his words the way a man does when he's deciding how much truth a conversation can hold. 22 years in the Navy, he said, most of it around men who did the kind of work nobody writes home about in detail. I spent some time attached to units that worked alongside special operations teams, support roles, logistics mostly, but I was close enough to see things.
"What kind of things?"
"The way certain people move through a crisis," Walter said.
"Calm that isn't performance.
Instinct that isn't panic. I saw women serving in roles most folks back home never even knew existed. Cultural support teams, they called them toward the end of my time in. Went out with the SEAL teams on missions regular support units never touched. Built trust with people who wouldn't have trusted a man in uniform." Vivian didn't say anything. She let him keep talking. "Folks back home who heard rumors about it, they didn't know the details," Walter continued. "They just heard women serving alongside SEALs, doing dangerous work most people couldn't imagine. Some of them started calling it something simpler, easier to say at a bar, easier to understand at a dinner table."
"They called us SEALs," Vivian said quietly.
"Wasn't accurate," Walter said. "But it wasn't exactly wrong either. What you all did took a different kind of nerve, harder in some ways. You didn't just fight when it came down to it. You had to read people, earn trust in places where trust could get you killed just as easily as a bullet could." Vivian looked out at the campus waking up around them. Students crossing the quad, backpacks slung over shoulders, none of them aware of the conversation happening on a bench near the flagpole.
12 years, she said finally. "That's what I gave it."
Walter turned to look at her, something like respect settling into his weathered face. "Then you understand something most folks in this town never will," he said. "Real strength doesn't announce itself. It just shows up quietly, exactly when it's needed." He stood brushing off his uniform pants and gave her a small nod. "Whatever's coming, Professor," he said. "You've got more than just patience on your side." He walked off toward the gate. Vivian sat there a moment longer, watching the morning settle over Millbrook College, feeling the weight of a truth she still hadn't fully spoken out loud to anyone in this town. Not yet. Grayson Whitfield had never been told no in any way that stuck. That was the problem, and everyone around him had spent 19 years making it worse. After the incident in room 214, something had shifted in him, though. Not in the direction anyone hoping for growth might have wished. He didn't feel shame. He felt exposed, and exposure for a boy raised the way Grayson had been raised felt a lot like weakness. Weakness in his mind needed correcting. He watched Joe Bellamy in the days that followed with a new kind of attention, colder, more calculated. He'd learned, without fully admitting it to himself, that going after her indirectly hadn't been enough to put things back the way he wanted them. So he decided to go after her directly. He gathered Marcus and his other friend, a heavy-set boy named Cole, in his dorm room 2 nights later. He didn't frame it as revenge, he never did. In his mind, it was correction, restoring balance to a world that had briefly, embarrassingly, tilted against him. "She's untouchable right now," Grayson said, pacing near the window. "My father handled the professor thing, but that Bellamy girl, she's the one who got Calder involved in the first place. Cut her out and the professor's got nothing left to make a fuss about." "What do you want to do?" Marcus asked. "Something that sticks," Grayson said. "Something the school can't just wave away." Marcus worked part-time in the campus IT office, running routine maintenance tickets during his shifts. He had more access than a student technically should have, a small oversight nobody had ever bothered to correct. It didn't take much convincing to get him to plant something. The opportunity arrived on a Tuesday, 10 days after the slap that had briefly made Grayson the subject of campus gossip. Millbrook College was hosting its annual Academic Integrity Review, a routine check the administration ran each semester to keep its accreditation clean. A small file, buried deep in a shared drive Joe used for a group project. Answer keys to an upcoming economics exam, copied without permission from a professor's private folder. It wasn't Joe's file. It wasn't Joe's doing. But by the time the automated integrity system flagged the folder, her name sat right there on the file's most recent access log, carefully arranged to look exactly damning enough. Vivian heard about it before Joe even knew what had happened. Eleanor found her in the faculty lounge, face tight with worry.
They're calling it academic dishonesty, Eleanor said. Some kind of stolen exam material, found in a file with Joe Bellamy's name attached.
That's not possible, Vivian said immediately. That girl works harder than half this campus combined.
I know that. You know that, Eleanor said. But the administration doesn't care about character right now. They care about a clean paper trail. And right now, the paper trail points at her.
Vivian set down her cup, mind already working through the shape of it, the timing, the convenience of it all.
Who reported the file?
Automated system flagged it during the routine sweep, Eleanor said.
But somebody had to put it there first.
Vivian nodded slowly. She'd spent 12 years learning how to separate a real threat from a manufactured one. This one had fingerprints all over it, even if she couldn't see them yet.
I need to see the access logs, she said. You're not IT, Vivian. You're a history professor.
I'm also someone who's spent a career learning how to find the truth buried under a convenient story, Vivian said. Let me try. It took her 3 days of careful, patient work. She talked to students Joe trusted. She asked quiet, specific questions in the IT office about how file permissions worked, framing her curiosity as simple professional interest rather than an investigation. She learned that Marcus, one of Grayson's closest friends, had access privileges that shouldn't have let him anywhere near that particular shared drive. She learned that the timestamp on the file's creation lined up almost exactly with a study session Grayson and his friends had attended in that same building 3 days before the exam. None of it was proof yet. Not the kind that would hold up in a formal hearing, but it was enough to see the outline of what had actually happened. She brought what she had to Dean Ashcombe. He listened, arms crossed, face carefully neutral in the way men get when they've already decided not to be moved by whatever comes next. "This is circumstantial," he said when she finished. "It's a pattern," Vivian said. "A pattern that points somewhere specific. Professor Calder, I understand your concern for Miss Bellamy, but we cannot act on suspicion alone. The evidence as it stands points to her account. The evidence was placed there," Vivian said, "by someone with a grudge against her and a friend with the access to make it happen." Ashcombe's jaw tightened. That's a serious accusation toward a family that has done a great deal for this institution. "That family's son slapped me in front of 30 students 2 weeks ago," Vivian said, "and nothing happened. Maybe it's time something did." The dean was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone lower, almost apologetic, in a way that told Vivian everything about how little power the man actually had left to use. "I'll note your concerns for the record," he said, "but the hearing will proceed as scheduled. I'm sorry, Professor. My hands are tied in ways you don't fully understand." Vivian left his office understanding exactly how tied his hands were and exactly whose hands were doing the tying. Preston Whitfield heard about Vivian's questions in the IT office the same afternoon she asked them. Small towns work that way. Small colleges work that way even faster. He didn't panic. Panic wasn't a reaction Preston Whitfield allowed himself, not after decades of practice keeping his composure while other people scrambled around him. He simply made a phone call. "The new history professor is asking questions," he said once the dean picked up, "about the Bellamy situation." "She's convinced there's more to it than what the system flagged," Ashcombe said carefully. "Is there?" A pause on the line. "Sir, I couldn't say for certain." "Then let's make certain it doesn't matter either way," Preston said. "Move up the timeline. I want this handled before it becomes a distraction." "Handled how, exactly?"
Professor Calder's contract is adjunct.
Reviewable at the board's discretion at any point for any reason we deem appropriate, Preston said. Draft the notice. Cite conduct concerns from the incident in her classroom. That should be more than sufficient. He hung up without waiting for a response. In his experience, people rarely argued once they understood exactly what was expected of them. He didn't think of Vivian Calder as a threat. He thought of her as a loose thread, easily trimmed before it could unravel anything that mattered. He had no idea, making that call from the comfort of his office, that the thread he was so carelessly trimming led directly back to a mistake he'd made 10 years earlier, one he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it no longer existed. That evening, she sat alone with her notebook again, the old habit returning the way it always did when a problem needed working through slowly. She thought about Preston Whitfield, about a man who bought silence the way other people bought groceries, without much thought, without much guilt, because the world had never once asked him to feel either. She thought about Arthur Lowry, forced out over questions about scholarship funds nobody dared ask twice. She thought about a name she hadn't let herself think about too directly in years, a name that belonged to a young man she'd served with years ago in a place where trust meant the difference between coming home and not coming home. His name had been Daniel. Daniel Lowry. She hadn't put it together fully until Joe said her grandfather's name out loud in that quiet classroom. Lowry wasn't an uncommon surname. It could have been coincidence. It wasn't. She opened the old leather notebook to a page near the back, one she hadn't looked at in a long time. A photograph, worn soft at the corners, of a young man in uniform grinning at the camera like the world hadn't yet taught him to stop. Daniel had talked about his father constantly, about a small town called Millbrook, about a college where his father had taught economics for 2 decades before something ugly forced him out, something involving money and silence and a family with more power than conscience. Daniel had also talked quieter in the moments before things went wrong on their final mission together, about a daughter back home he barely knew, a little girl he'd left behind before he'd fully understood what fatherhood would have meant to him. He never got the chance to understand it. Vivian had made him a promise in the last few minutes that mattered, a promise made the way promises get made in places like that, simple and absolute, with no room left for excuses later. She would look out for his family. Whatever that took, however long it took. She had come to Millbrook believing she was simply choosing a quiet town to start over in. She understood now that some part of her, some quiet, patient part that never stopped keeping promises, had been looking for this town all along. Joe Bellamy wasn't just a student who needed protecting. She was the reason Vivian Calder had come to Millbrook in the first place, even if she hadn't fully admitted that to herself, until tonight. She didn't tell Joe everything the next day. Some truths need the right moment, not just the next available one. But she found the girl after class, sat with her in the quiet of an empty classroom, and told her enough. "I served with someone once," Vivian said carefully. "A long time ago. Someone brave and kind, and not nearly careful enough with his own safety when it came to protecting the people around him." Joe watched her quiet, sensing something important was happening even before she understood what. "His name was Daniel," Vivian continued. "He talked about his father a lot, about a small town called Millbrook." Joe's breath caught. "My father's name was Daniel, I know," Vivian said gently. For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. "He didn't come home," Vivian said finally. "I'm sorry, I should have found a better way to tell you that." Joe's eyes filled, though she didn't look away. "Nobody ever really told me anything about him. Just that he served and he didn't make it back and that Grandpa didn't like talking about it because it hurt too much." "He talked about you," Vivian said, "near the end. He wanted you to know that." Joe pressed a hand over her mouth, tears sliding free despite the effort to hold them back. "Is that why you came here?" she asked when she could finally speak again. "To Millbrook? Was it because of him?" Vivian considered the question honestly, the way she owed this girl nothing less than honesty. "Partly," she said. "I made him a promise. I intend to keep it. Whatever that ends up meaning. Jo wiped her face with the back of her hand, something steadying in her expression despite the tears still standing in her eyes. "Nobody's ever kept a promise like that for me before," she said quietly. "Then it's about time somebody did," Vivian said, again the same words she'd offered weeks earlier, meaning something entirely different now that the truth stood fully between them. The hearing notice arrived 2 days later, delivered to Vivian's faculty mailbox in a plain, sealed envelope. She read it, standing in the mailroom, other faculty members moving past her, unaware of what she now held in her hands. The Board of Trustees would convene in 3 days to review her continued employment at Millbrook College. The letter cited in careful bureaucratic language concerns about her conduct and judgment following the incident in room 214, along with newly raised questions about her involvement in the ongoing academic integrity investigation concerning a student. There was no mention of Grayson's hand connecting with her face. There was no mention of a fabricated file planted by a friend with borrowed access. There was only the careful, polished language of an institution protecting the family that funded it. Vivian folded the letter and put it in her bag. She wasn't afraid. She'd faced worse odds than a college hearing board. But she understood standing there in that quiet mailroom that 3 days wasn't much time to build the kind of case that could hold up against a man like Preston Whitfield. She would need help, real help, the kind that came from people willing to risk something of their own. She started with Eleanor, catching her before her afternoon lab. "They're moving to terminate my contract," Vivian said, keeping her voice low. 3 days. I need whatever you know about how the board handles these hearings." Eleanor's face went pale, then hardened into something Vivian hadn't seen from her before. "Resolve." "I've sat through hearings like this before," Eleanor said. "Watched them dress up a predetermined outcome as a fair process. It's designed to look thorough while giving them exactly the result they walked in wanting." "Then I need to give them a reason to want a different result," Vivian said. Eleanor nodded slowly. "I'll help however I can. I should have done more for Arthur Lowry all those years ago. I let fear keep me quiet. I won't make that mistake twice." She was true to her word. That night, Eleanor drove to the small storage annex behind the administration building where old faculty records sat boxed and mostly forgotten, and spent 3 hours combing through files she hadn't opened in a decade. She found what she was looking for near midnight. A thin folder marked only with a date and a case number containing the original complaint Arthur Lowry had filed about the scholarship fund all those years ago, along with the administration's quiet, unceremonious response. The numbers didn't add up, even now, even after 10 years of dust. Scholarship funds earmarked for need-based students had been quietly redirected year after year into accounts connected to Whitfield family business interests. Small amounts individually, enough over a decade to matter considerably. Arthur Lowry had noticed the discrepancy and asked the wrong questions to the wrong people. 6 months later, he was gone, his contract not renewed due to budget considerations, the very same language the dean had used with Vivian just days before. Eleanor sat alone in that dusty storage room, the folder open on her lap, and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in 10 years. Shame for staying silent. And underneath it something sharper, resolve. She photographed every page carefully on her phone before returning the folder exactly as she'd found it. Then she drove straight to Vivian's apartment, arriving well past midnight, folder photographs already loaded and ready to show. "I found the pattern," she said when Vivian opened the door. "It's the same pattern, Vivian. 10 years ago and now. Whitfield money, buried questions, and somebody paying the price for asking them." Vivian went next to Walter, finding him on his evening rounds near the science building. "I need someone who understands how to look for evidence that's been buried," she said. "Not destroyed. Buried. There's a difference." Walter listened as she explained everything. The file, the access logs, the timing that lined up too neatly to be accidental. "IT keeps backup logs the students don't know about," Walter said once she'd finished. "System redundancy, mostly for legal protection more than security. If someone deleted the original trail, there might still be a shadow of it somewhere in the backups." "Can you get access to that?" "Not directly," Walter admitted. "But I know who can. Owe me a favor or two around this place after 15 years. I don't have much time, Vivian said. The hearing is in 3 days. Walter's expression settled into something steady, something Vivian recognized from long experience as the look of a man deciding to commit fully to something bigger than himself. Then we'd best get moving, he said. 3 days is enough time if we don't waste a single hour of it. He was as good as his word. The next afternoon, he brought Vivian to a small side office near the IT department, introducing her to a nervous-looking young technician named Sam, who owed Walter more favors than he cared to count.
Show her what you showed me, Walter said.
Sam pulled up a series of server logs on his screen, hands slightly unsteady. The original access trail for that shared folder was wiped about 6 hours after the file was flagged. Somebody with admin privileges did it. Clean deletion, no obvious trace left in the standard logs. But not the backups, Vivian said. Backups run on a separate system, Sam said. Most people don't even know they exist. Legal requirement, mostly in case of disputes. He pulled up another window, scrolling through rows of time-stamped data. Here, 6 days before the flag at 11:40 at night, somebody logged in using Marcus Reyes's credentials and copied the exam file into that shared folder. Vivian leaned closer, studying the timestamp carefully. Can you confirm the physical location of that login? Sam nodded, pulling up one more screen. IP address traces back to the dorm building, same building where Grayson Whitfield lives. Room 3 doors down from Marcus Reyes, actually. It wasn't a smoking gun by itself, but layered together with everything else Vivian had already gathered, it was starting to look like exactly what it was. A plan poorly disguised, executed by boys who had never once needed to be careful before. Vivian pulled out her phone and photographed both screens carefully, twice each, before Sam closed the windows. Old habit. She'd learned long ago never to leave a piece of evidence sitting in only one place. Can you get this into a format the board would accept as evidence? Vivian asked. I can try, Sam said. I'd need explicit authorization, though. Pulling backup logs without proper clearance could get me fired. Walter put a steady hand on the young man's shoulder. I'll square it with the department head. You let me handle that part. You just make sure this doesn't disappear before Thursday. Sam nodded, some of the nervousness settling into resolve. Yes, sir. They left the office together, Vivian's mind already moving 3 steps ahead, mapping out exactly how this piece would need to fit alongside everything else before the hearing. That night, back in her apartment, Vivian sat with the leather notebook open on the table in front of her, the photograph of Daniel Lowry propped against the lamp. She thought about how strange it was, the shape a life takes sometimes. A promise made in a moment of chaos, half a world away, quietly steering her toward a small town she'd never heard of before a job listing crossed her desk. She thought about Preston Whitfield, sitting comfortably in his house on the north edge of town, believing the matter of one inconvenient professor was already closed. He had no idea what he'd actually started. She thought about Arthur Lowry, forced to watch his life's work dismantled by a family too powerful to question, and about the granddaughter he'd raised alone, carrying a quiet strength she likely didn't even recognize in herself yet. She thought about all the people in this town who had learned slowly and carefully to look away from things that needed looking at. Some of them were starting to look back now. Eleanor, Walter, a quiet sophomore named Peter still carrying 11 seconds of footage in a folder 3 layers deep, though Vivian didn't know that yet. It wasn't much. 3 days, a handful of allies, and a system built to protect exactly the kind of man she was up against. But she had faced longer odds before, in places where the stakes were measured in lives rather than careers. She closed the notebook gently, the photograph of Daniel Lowry still resting where she could see it. I haven't forgotten, she said quietly, to no one but the empty room. I'm not going to start now. Outside her window, Millbrook settled into another dark evening, unaware that the quiet history professor at the center of its latest scandal was no longer simply defending herself. She was keeping a promise. And promises like that, made in places most people never had to survive, tend to be the hardest kind to break. The next morning, the campus buzzed with a different kind of gossip. Word had spread that the board was moving against the new professor. Some students felt satisfied by it, having absorbed enough of the twisted version of events to believe she somehow deserved it. Others felt uneasy without quite understanding why, the way people sometimes sense an injustice, even when they can't articulate its shape. Joe found Vivian outside room 214 before the first class of the day, worry etched across her young face.
I heard about the hearing, she said. This is because of me, isn't it? Because you stood up for me.
This is because of a man who spent his whole life avoiding consequences, Vivian said. None of this is your fault, Joe. Don't carry that.
But if you hadn't defended me that day, none of this would be happening.
Vivian crouched slightly, meeting the girl's eyes directly.
Your father didn't hesitate when it mattered, she said. Not once, in all the time I knew him.
I'm not about to hesitate now either. Some things are worth standing up for, no matter what it costs. He taught me that. I intend to keep teaching it, however this ends. Joe nodded, tears standing in her eyes again, though her chin lifted with something that looked for the first time like real strength rather than fear.
Then let me help, she said.
Whatever you need. I'm not just going to stand here and watch this happen. Vivian studied her for a long moment, seeing clearly now the same quiet courage that had once defined her father, passed down through blood and grief into a girl who hadn't even known it was hers to inherit.
All right, Vivian said finally. There might be something you can do.
She explained carefully, giving Joe a simple, safe task.
Talk to other students quietly and see if anyone else had noticed anything unusual about the shared drive or about Marcus and Cole's behavior in the days before the file was flagged.
Joe took the assignment seriously. Over the next 2 days, she approached 3 classmates she trusted, careful not to draw attention to, careful not to let word travel back to Grayson before it needed to. One of them, a quiet young man from her economics discussion section, mentioned something offhand that made Joe's pulse quicken.
Funny thing, he said. Peter was acting weird that day too. The day of the slap thing, I mean. Kept fiddling with his phone right after it happened, like he'd filmed something.
Joe brought this straight to Vivian that evening.
Peter,
Vivian repeated slowly. Which Peter? Quiet guy sits by the window in your class, Joe said. Doesn't say much. Vivian felt something settle into place, a piece of the puzzle she hadn't even known was missing until this moment.
Find him for me, she said, carefully.
Don't make it feel like a big deal, or he might get scared and delete whatever he has. Sam called Walter early the next morning, voice tight with worry.
The backup logs, he said. The ones I pulled yesterday. Somebody accessed the system overnight and wiped the segment covering that timestamp.
Walter's jaw tightened. Can you recover it?
Not the live copy, not without specialized recovery tools we don't have on site, Sam said. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for.
This wasn't random. This was targeted. Walter relayed the news to Vivian within the hour, finding her outside the history building before her first class. Somebody's covering tracks faster than we can uncover them, he said grimly. Whitfield's got more reach in this campus than either of us fully accounted for. Vivian absorbed the news without visible reaction, though something cold settled behind her eyes.
I photographed both screens before we left that office, she said. We still have the timestamp and the location trace even without the live system. And the wipe itself is evidence now too. Somebody only erases a trail that dangerous when it actually leads somewhere. We build the case around all of it. We still have Eleanor's records. We still have whatever Joe's tracking down with that video. We adapt.
You sound awfully calm for someone who just lost a key piece of evidence, Walter said.
I've lost bigger things than a server log before, Vivian said quietly.
You learn to keep moving anyway. Sitting still because one plan fell apart, that's how people get left behind in situations far worse than this one. Walter nodded slowly, something like renewed determination settling into his weathered face. They found him that afternoon, sitting alone at a table in the corner of the library, textbook open in front of him, though his eyes weren't really moving across the page. Vivian sat down across from him, careful to keep her voice light, unthreatening.
Peter?
Right.
You're in my 2 o'clock section.
He looked up, startled.
Yeah, Professor Calder.
I heard you might have something that could help me, she said gently. No pressure. But if you do, now would be a good time to share it. Peter's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to her, something anxious working behind them. I don't want any trouble, he said quietly. Grayson's friends, they're not exactly forgiving people. I understand that fear, Vivian said. I'm not going to pretend there's no risk in doing the right thing here. There usually is. But sometimes the risk of staying silent costs more in the long run than the risk of speaking up. Peter was quiet for a long moment, weighing something Vivian couldn't fully see. I filmed part of it, he admitted finally, after he slapped you. Just 11 seconds. I don't even really know why I did it. Can I see it? He hesitated, then pulled out his phone, hands slightly unsteady, and played the short clip. It was exactly what Vivian needed. Grayson's raised hand still visible in the frame's opening second, the sound of the slap clear on the audio, followed by her own voice, steady and calm, delivering the line the whole room had heard. I don't look for trouble, but I don't run from it either. This is important, Peter, Vivian said carefully. Would you be willing to submit this to the board hearing? I won't force you, but it could change everything. Peter looked down at his phone for a long moment. They'll know it was me, he said. Grayson and his friends. They'll figure it out. They might, Vivian admitted. I won't lie to you about that, but you'd be standing on the right side of something that matters. That's worth more than most people realize until they're the ones who finally do it. Peter was quiet for a long time. When he finally looked up, something had settled in his expression. Nervous still, but resolved underneath the nerves. Okay, he said. I'll do it. Somebody should have stood up for you that day. I should have. This is the least I can do now. Vivian felt something ease slightly in her chest, the first real piece of solid ground beneath a case that had felt until this moment built almost entirely out of shifting sand. Thank you, she said simply. That took courage. Word moved differently through Millbrook College over the following 2 days, quieter this time, not the loud, careless gossip of the first week, but something more deliberate. A few students who had witnessed the incident in room 214 began speaking more openly about what they had actually seen, no longer content to let the softened, twisted version stand unchallenged. One young woman approached Eleanor directly, offering to write a statement about Grayson's pattern of behavior toward Joe over the semester, behavior she'd watched unfold in 3 different classes. A groundskeeper mentioned almost in passing to Walter that he'd noticed Marcus and Cole loitering near the IT building later than usual on the night in question, smoking near the service entrance, where the security cameras had a known blind spot. None of it was overwhelming on its own, but taken together, a shape was forming. A community slowly, carefully remembering how to look directly at something instead of away from it. Not everyone shifted. Some students still avoided Vivian in the hallways, still repeated the comfortable version of events that required nothing from them. Preston Whitfield's reach into this town ran deep. Deep enough that plenty of people had good reason to stay quiet regardless of what they privately believed. But enough people were starting to lean the other way. Enough that Vivian, watching it happen in small, quiet moments throughout her days, allowed herself something she hadn't felt in a long while. Something close to hope. The night before the hearing, Vivian gathered everyone in Eleanor's small house on the edge of campus. Walter, Eleanor, Sam, and Peter, each of them carrying a piece of what would need to come together the next morning. Let's go through it one more time, Vivian said, spreading papers across Eleanor's dining table. Peter's footage establishes the assault clearly, and my response to it. Eleanor's records established the pattern with Arthur Lowry 10 years ago. Sam's testimony, even without the wiped logs, can speak to what he witnessed and the timing of the deletion itself, which raises its own questions about who had motive to erase it. It's not everything we hoped for, Walter said, but it's more than nothing, a lot more. The board isn't looking for a perfect case, Eleanor said. They're looking for permission to do the wrong thing quietly. Our job is to make that permission harder to grant. Make them look bad if they try. Vivian nodded slowly, studying the small collection of evidence spread across the table. It wasn't the kind of case she would have wanted building slowly, out of borrowed favors and nervous witnesses and old dusty files nearly lost to time. But it was honest. Every piece of it was true. Sometimes she thought that had to be enough. "There's one more thing," Jo said quietly from where she'd been sitting silent in the corner most of the evening. Everyone turned to look at her. "My grandfather," she said. "Arthur, I called him tonight, told him everything. He wants to come tomorrow, to the hearing." The room went still for a moment. "Are you sure that's wise?" Eleanor asked gently. "It might be painful for him, revisiting all of this." "He said it's been painful for 10 years staying quiet about it," Jo said. "He said maybe it's time that stopped." Vivian felt something tighten in her chest, a mixture of gratitude and quiet awe at the courage forming in this small living room gathered from people who had every reason to stay safely uninvolved and had chosen each of them not to. "Then we'll have him there," she said. "Every voice in that room tomorrow matters. His most of all." Preston Whitfield spent that same evening at home entirely unaware of the quiet gathering unfolding across town. He reviewed his notes for the hearing with the calm satisfaction of a man who had never once watched a plan of his fail to unfold exactly as intended. Conduct concerns, judgment issues, a carefully worded narrative that painted Vivian Calder as unstable, reactive, unsuited for a teaching position at an institution as respected as Millbrook College. He didn't think about Arthur Lowry that night. He hadn't thought about the man in years. The whole matter filed away long ago under the comfortable heading of problems successfully solved. He had no idea that somewhere in this small town, an old economics professor was preparing after 10 long years of silence to finally speak. He had no idea that a 19-year-old's careless cruelty had led directly back to a debt his family had never actually paid. He believed, as he turned off his desk lamp and settled in for an untroubled night's sleep, that tomorrow would simply be one more inconvenience handled quietly, the way his family had always handled inconveniences. He was wrong. And unlike most of his mistakes, this one would not stay buried. Vivian didn't sleep much that night either, though for entirely different reasons than the man across town. She sat by her window, the old leather notebook open beside her, the photograph of Daniel Lowry propped where the streetlight outside caught it just enough to see. "Tomorrow," she said quietly to the photograph, to the promise it represented, to the 12 years of training that had brought her exactly to this moment without her ever fully understanding why until now. She thought about her father and Arthur and the granddaughter he'd raised alone with more strength than either of them had ever fully recognized in her. She thought about a small town on the edge of deciding whether it would keep looking away or finally choose to look directly at the truth sitting right in front of it. Whatever happened tomorrow, she understood one thing clearly sitting alone in the quiet dark of her apartment. She had already kept the promise that mattered most. She had shown up. She had stood between someone vulnerable and the people trying to hurt her exactly the way Daniel would have wanted. Everything else tomorrow would decide. She closed the notebook gently, turned off the lamp, and let herself finally rest, ready for whatever the morning would bring. Millbrook College had no idea what was walking through its doors tomorrow. It was about to find out. 3 days. That was all the time left before the Board of Trustees would decide whether Vivian Calder stayed in Millbrook or disappeared from it entirely, the way Arthur Lowry had disappeared years before her. Preston Whitfield believed the outcome was already settled. He had spent his whole life shaping outcomes exactly the way he wanted them, and saw no reason this would be any different. He didn't know about the buried backup logs Walter was quietly chasing down. He didn't know about Eleanor gathering old records from a decade earlier with trembling hands and a resolve she hadn't felt in years. He didn't know about Jo, determined for the first time in her life to fight back instead of shrinking away. And he certainly didn't know about a promise made years ago in a place he would never understand between two soldiers who trusted each other with the only thing that ever really mattered in the end, each other's word. Vivian intended to keep hers, whatever it cost her, whatever this small, quiet town threw in her path over the next 3 days. She had survived far worse, with far less standing beside her. This time she wasn't standing alone. That, more than anything else, was about to make all the difference. Some mornings arrive quietly and still manage to change everything that comes after them. This was one of those mornings. Millbrook College woke to a gray sky and a low mist sitting over the quad, the kind of morning that feels like the whole world is holding its breath, waiting to see which way something important will fall. Vivian Calder woke early, the way she always did. She dressed carefully, not for comfort, for clarity. A plain dark blazer hair pulled back the same simple way it always was. Nothing about her appearance meant to draw attention. She placed the old leather notebook in her bag, then, after a long moment of consideration, she reached inside its worn cover and carefully unwrapped the small cloth bundle she hadn't opened in months. The metal caught the morning light briefly before she wrapped it again, gently, and placed it in her bag beside the notebook. She wasn't planning to use it as a weapon. She never had, not once in 12 years. But some mornings called for carrying the full truth with you, even the parts you usually kept quiet. Today was one of those mornings too. She stood for a moment at her kitchen window before leaving, looking out at the gray light settling over the rooftops of Millbrook, and thought about how strange the road here had been. A town she'd chosen almost at random, or so she'd believed at the time. A job listing that had caught her eye for no reason she could fully explain. She understood now that nothing about it had been random at all. 12 years of training had taught her to trust instinct, even when the reasons behind it weren't yet clear. Her instinct had led her here to this small town, to this particular fight, and she intended to see it through with the same steadiness that had carried her through every difficult room she'd ever walked into before. She picked up her bag, checked once more that the notebook sat safely inside, and stepped out into the gray Millbrook morning. The boardroom at Millbrook College sat on the second floor of the administration building, a long wood-paneled space with a row of high windows that let in exactly the kind of gray, indifferent light a room like that deserved. By 9 o'clock, it was nearly full. Members of the Board of Trustees sat along a raised table at the front, 7 in total. Preston Whitfield seated at the center, with the quiet, settled confidence of a man who had never once lost a fight he'd started. Dean Ashcombe sat near the wall, folder in his lap, avoiding eye contact with almost everyone. Vivian sat at a small table facing the bored Eleanor beside her, both of them dressed simply, both of them carrying themselves with a stillness that unsettled more than one person watching. Behind them, the gallery seats filled steadily, students, faculty, a few concerned parents who had heard fragments of the story and wanted to see for themselves how it would end. Walter stood near the back, arms crossed, uniform pressed, watching the room the way he'd once watched far more dangerous rooms. Joe sat in the second row, an elderly man beside her, silver-haired, dignified, despite the visible weight of years and old grief carried carefully on his shoulders. Arthur Lowry had come exactly as promised. Grayson sat 2 rows behind his father, flanked by Marcus and Cole, all 3 of them wearing the particular kind of confidence boys wear when they've never once had to answer for anything in their lives. That confidence hadn't cracked yet. It was about to. Preston Whitfield opened the proceedings himself, his voice calm, measured, practiced. This hearing has been convened to review the continued employment of Professor Vivian Calder in light of conduct concerns arising from an incident in her classroom and subsequent behavior the administration has found troubling. He glanced briefly toward Vivian, something almost bored in his expression, a man simply moving through motions he'd performed 100 times before, in one form or another. Professor Calder, you may respond to the concerns outlined in your notice. Vivian rose slowly. She didn't rush. She'd learned long ago that rushing gave a room permission to underestimate you further. Thank you, she said. I'd like to begin by clarifying what actually happened in my classroom 3 weeks ago, since the notice I received contained no mention of it. A ripple moved through the gallery. On the day in question, Vivian continued, a student in my class struck me in front of 30 witnesses after I asked him to return a personal item he had taken from another student without permission. Allegations of that nature were reviewed informally at the time, Preston said smoothly. The dean determined no formal action was necessary. The dean determined that quietly without input from me and without any record of the incident appearing anywhere in the notice explaining why I'm sitting in this chair today, Vivian said. I'd like that corrected for the record before we proceed further. Preston's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Noted. Please continue. I also understand, Vivian said, that concerns have been raised about my involvement in investigating a separate academic integrity matter involving a student named Josephine Bellamy. You inserted yourself into an active investigation that was not within your responsibilities, one board member said, a thin woman near the end of the table. I inserted myself into an investigation that was building a case against an innocent student based on evidence that was deliberately fabricated, Vivian said. I have documentation supporting that claim if the board is willing to review it. Preston's expression didn't shift, though something in his eyes sharpened slightly. This is a serious accusation, Professor Calder, he said. I trust you have something more substantial than suspicion to support it. I do, Vivian said. She nodded toward Eleanor, who rose and began distributing printed copies of the evidence they'd assembled, hands steady despite the weight of the moment. The presentation took nearly 40 minutes. Sam's testimony, delivered nervously but clearly, walked the board through what he'd found. The timestamp and the location trace back to the dorm building preserved in photographs Vivian had taken directly off his screen before the original data vanished, and the deletion log itself, which showed the segment had been wiped less than 12 hours after Vivian had begun asking questions. You're suggesting someone deliberately destroyed evidence? Another board member said, frowning. I'm stating what the photographs and the deletion record together show, Sam said. Someone with administrative access removed the relevant segment overnight, right after we'd pulled it up. I can't speak to intent. I can speak to what happened technically. A woman near the end of the board table leaned forward. Mr. Reyes, the student named in these logs, is he present today? He is, Vivian said, gesturing toward the gallery where Marcus sat rigid beside Grayson, his face draining of color as every head in the room turned toward him. Mr. Reyes, the board member said, would you care to respond to this evidence? Marcus stood slowly, glancing toward Grayson, who kept his eyes fixed firmly on the table in front of him, offering no support at all. Marcus started, then stopped, swallowing hard. I have access through my IT position. I don't remember exactly what I accessed that night. The logs are quite specific about the timing, the board member said evenly. 11:40 at night. Would you like more time to remember? Marcus sat back down without answering, the silence itself answering clearly enough for everyone in the room. Preston leaned forward slightly. And who exactly do you believe had motive to fabricate evidence against Miss Bellamy in the first place? This was the moment Vivian had known would arrive. She met his gaze directly. I believe it connects to an ongoing pattern of behavior from your son and his friends toward Miss Bellamy, she said. A pattern that began well before the incident in my classroom. A murmur moved through the gallery. Grayson shifted in his seat, some of his earlier confidence finally beginning to crack. That's a serious accusation to level at a student who isn't formally part of these proceedings, Preston said, voice cooling several degrees. Then perhaps he should be, Vivian said. She nodded again, and Peter, sitting quietly near the front of the gallery, rose on unsteady legs and walked forward. I have something the board should see, he said, voice barely above a whisper at first, though it steadied as he continued. Video footage from the day of the incident in Professor Calder's classroom. He handed his phone forward. One of the board members connected it to the room's display screen, and 11 seconds of footage played across the wall for the entire room to see. The sound of the slap. The stunned silence afterward. Vivian's own voice, steady and even, delivering the line the whole room had heard weeks earlier. I don't look for trouble, but I don't run from it either. The gallery went utterly silent. Grayson's face had gone pale. Marcus and Cole both stared at the floor, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Preston Whitfield, for the first time since the hearing began, said nothing at all. Eleanor rose next folder, trembling slightly in her hands, though her voice remained steady. "I'd like to submit records concerning a similar situation from approximately 10 years ago," she said, "involving a former economics professor named Arthur Lowry." Preston's head turned sharply toward her. "That matter has no bearing on these proceedings."
"I believe it has every bearing," Eleanor said. "Professor Lowry raised concerns about the handling of scholarship funds, concerns tied to accounts connected with Whitfield family business interests. Within 6 months, his contract was not renewed, using language nearly identical to the language used in Professor Calder's notice this week." She held up 2 documents side by side, the language visibly matching in several key passages.
"That is a remarkable coincidence, if it is one," Eleanor said quietly. Preston's composure held barely, though something colder had entered his expression now. "Budget considerations are a standard part of institutional decision-making," he said. "I fail to see how a decade-old personnel matter is relevant to today's hearing." "It's relevant," said a new voice from the gallery, "because I'm the man you did it to." Every head in the room turned. Arthur Lowry rose slowly from his seat beside Joe, leaning slightly on a cane, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the silent room. "I taught economics at this college for 20 years, Arthur said. "I loved this institution. I loved these students. And 10 years ago, I made the mistake of asking why scholarship money meant for students who needed it most kept quietly disappearing into accounts that had nothing to do with them." He paused, steadying himself, Joe's hand reaching up to rest gently on his arm. "Within a season, I was gone. No hearing. No chance to defend myself in a room like this one. Just a quiet letter and a town that decided it was easier to forget me than to ask hard questions about the family that funded half the buildings on this campus." His eyes settled on Preston Whitfield, steady despite the visible tremor in his hands. "I stayed quiet for 10 years, Preston. Told myself it wasn't worth the fight. Told myself an old man's reputation wasn't worth risking what little peace I had left." He shook his head slowly. "I was wrong. I should have spoken up a long time ago. I'm speaking up now." The room sat in stunned silence. "My granddaughter," Arthur continued, voice thickening slightly, "has spent the past several weeks being tormented by your son, in the same building, on the same campus, under the shadow of the same family name that once destroyed my career. If that isn't a pattern, Preston, I don't know what a pattern looks like anymore." Preston Whitfield, for the first time in longer than most people in that room could remember, appeared to have nothing prepared to say. It was Vivian who broke the silence that followed, rising once more, her voice calm but carrying a different kind of weight now. "I'd like to add one more piece of context," she said, "though it has nothing to do with fabricated evidence or missing server logs." She reached into her bag and withdrew the old leather notebook, setting it gently on the table in front of her. "Some of you have heard rumors about my background," she said. "I understand the title people have used isn't entirely accurate, and I'd like to correct that briefly for the record." She glanced toward Walter standing quietly near the back of the room, who gave her a small, steady nod. "I served 12 years in the United States Navy," Vivian said. "Not as a SEAL precisely, though I understand why people simplified it that way. I served as part of a support team that operated directly alongside SEAL units in some of the most difficult environments our military asked anyone to work in. My job wasn't to fight, not primarily. My job was to build trust with people who had every reason not to trust anyone in uniform, and to keep the people around me alive while doing it." She opened the notebook carefully, withdrawing the small cloth bundle from its back cover, unwrapping it slowly to reveal the metal inside. A few gasps moved through the gallery. "I'm not sharing this for sympathy or for credibility, though I understand it may carry both," Vivian said. "I'm sharing it because it explains why I came to Millbrook in the first place and why I have not been willing to stay quiet no matter how much pressure this institution has applied over the past 3 days." She looked toward Joe and Arthur, something gentle entering her expression. "I served alongside a young man named Daniel Lowry," she said. "Arthur's son. Joe's father.
He didn't come home from our final deployment together. Before he died, he asked me to look out for the family he left behind if I ever found my way to this town. The room had gone completely still. I didn't come to Millbrook by accident, Vivian said. I came here to keep a promise. I had no idea when I accepted this teaching position how directly that promise would collide with the very family responsible for hurting the people I came here to protect. She closed the notebook gently, folding the cloth back over the metal with careful, practiced hands. I'm not asking this board to reinstate me out of sympathy, she said. I'm asking you to look honestly at the evidence in front of you and to finally do what should have been done for Professor Lowry 10 years ago. For a long moment, nobody in the room spoke at all. Then, slowly, one of the board members, an older man who had sat silent through most of the proceedings, cleared his throat. Preston, he said quietly, I think we need a recess, and I think when we return we need to discuss considerably more than Professor Calder's contract. Preston Whitfield sat very still, the practiced calm finally visibly beginning to crumble around the edges. He looked toward his son, whose face had gone white and stricken in the row behind him, and something passed between father and son that neither had ever fully confronted before. The weight of consequence arriving all at once after 19 years of never having to feel it. The recess lasted nearly an hour. When the board reconvened, the mood in the room had shifted entirely. Whispers had moved through the gallery during the break, the true shape of the story finally settling into place for people who had spent weeks hearing only fragments and rumors. The older board member who had called for the recess spoke first this time, not Preston. After reviewing the evidence presented today, he said, this board finds no basis to terminate Professor Calder's employment. Quite the opposite. We find substantial evidence of academic misconduct on the part of several students, evidence tampering involving campus IT systems, and deeply troubling questions regarding the handling of a personnel matter a decade ago that this board intends to formally reopen. He turned to look directly at Preston. Given the serious conflict of interest evident throughout these proceedings and the direct involvement of your family in the matters under review, I move that Preston Whitfield step down from his position as chair of this board, effective immediately, pending a full independent review of both incidents. The motion passed unanimously. Preston did not vote against it. He simply sat silent, staring at the table in front of him, the empire of quiet control he'd built over decades finally visibly beginning to come apart. News of what had happened in that boardroom spread through Millbrook College before the afternoon classes had even let out. This time, there was no twisting of the story, no comfortable, softened version passed quietly between students eager to avoid inconvenient truths. Too many people had witnessed it directly. Too much of it had happened in a room full of watching eyes. By evening, the story had reached the town beyond the campus gates as well. The diner on Main Street buzzed with hushed conversation. The waitress, who had once welcomed Vivian to town on her very first weekend, found herself 2 tables over, quietly telling a group of regulars the whole account, piece by piece, shaking her head slowly at certain parts.
12 years in the service, she said, and nobody in this whole town had any idea. Just goes to show, doesn't it? You never really know what somebody's carrying until the moment it finally matters.
Not everyone in Millbrook reacted with immediate sympathy. The Whitfield name still carried weight, still carried decades of goodwill built through donations and civic involvement that didn't simply evaporate overnight. Some longtime residents found themselves defending Preston out of old loyalty, uncomfortable with how quickly the ground had shifted beneath a family they'd known for generations. But something had cracked open that couldn't fully close again. A town that had spent years quietly looking away from uncomfortable truths had been handed all at once undeniable proof of exactly what that silence had cost. Slowly, in the weeks that followed, more people began speaking up about things they'd noticed over the years and never mentioned. A parent who'd quietly transferred her daughter out of Millbrook years earlier after an incident nobody had believed at the time. A former employee of one of Preston's businesses describing a pattern of pressure and intimidation eerily similar to what had unfolded at the college. None of it changed what had already happened, but each new voice made it a little bit harder for the next injustice to hide in the same comfortable shadows.
Grayson Whitfield had spent 19 years believing consequences were things that happened to other people. Sitting in that gallery, watching his father's composure crumble in real time, watching the full weight of everything he'd done laid bare in front of the entire campus, something in him finally, genuinely broke. He rose on unsteady legs before the board could formally dismiss the proceedings.
Can I say something?
He said, voice cracking slightly. The room quieted. Preston turned toward his son, something like warning in his expression, though it no longer carried the force it once had.
I filed the fake evidence against Joe, Grayson said,
the words coming faster now, like something long held back finally breaking loose.
I asked Marcus to plan it. I did it because Professor Calder embarrassed me, and I couldn't stand feeling small like that, so I made someone else feel smaller instead.
He turned toward Joe, sitting beside her grandfather, tears standing visibly in his eyes now.
I'm sorry, he said. I've been sorry since before today, honestly. I just didn't know how to say it without looking weak.
I thought that mattered more than it actually does. Joe looked at him for a long moment, something complicated moving across her face, grief and anger, and something like cautious relief all at once.
It's a start, she said quietly. It's not everything, but it's a start.
Grayson nodded, sitting back down heavily, the weight of 19 years of unchecked behavior finally, painfully beginning to settle where it belonged. The formal consequences arrived over the following days. Preston Whitfield resigned from the board entirely, not just the chairmanship, following the independent review's early findings regarding both the scholarship fund and the fabricated evidence against Joe. The college's independent counsel forwarded the financial records to the county sheriff's office within the week. Sheriff Thomas Riley, a steady, unhurried man who had run the department for over a decade, opened a formal inquiry into the scholarship fund himself, treating the matter with the same plain, careful thoroughness he brought to every case that crossed his desk. Legal proceedings began shortly after, the full details of which would take months to unfold, though the outcome was no longer seriously in doubt. Grayson faced a formal disciplinary review of his own. The board, weighing his age, his voluntary confession, and the clear pattern of his upbringing against the seriousness of his actions, ultimately suspended him for a full academic year, rather than expelling him outright, with mandatory conditions attached. Counseling, community service, a formal apology delivered directly to both Joe and Vivian in writing and in person. Marcus and Cole faced their own separate disciplinary consequences, less severe, though neither escaped accountability entirely. Walter found Vivian outside the administration building that evening, the crowd from the hearing long since dispersed, the campus settling into its usual quiet dusk. "You did good work today," he said.
"Better than good. We did it together," Vivian said. "I couldn't have built that case alone, not in 3 days."
Walter nodded slowly, looking out over the darkening quad. 22 years I served. Watched a lot of good people get chewed up by systems that were supposed to protect them. Doesn't happen too often you get to watch one of those systems actually get corrected instead.
"It's not fully corrected yet," Vivian said. "There's still a long road ahead, for Preston, for Grayson, for this whole town, honestly."
"Maybe so," Walter said, "but today the truth won. That's worth something, even if the road's still long." He was quiet for a moment, studying her carefully. "Can I ask you something, Professor? Off the record again."
"Go ahead."
"That medal," he said. "You didn't have to show that today. Could have won this without it, maybe. Why'd you decide to bring it out?" Vivian considered the question for a long moment before answering.
"Because I spent 12 years learning that some truths are worth protecting quietly," she said. "And I spent this month learning that some truths are worth protecting loudly when the moment finally calls for it."
Today called for it. Walter nodded, something like deep respect settling into his weathered face. "Well," he said, "for what it's worth, ma'am, this town's lucky you found your way here, whether it fully understands that yet or not." He tipped his head respectfully and walked off into the settling dusk, leaving Vivian alone for a moment with the quiet campus and the long, strange journey that had brought her exactly here. Eleanor caught up with her a moment later, still slightly out of breath from hurrying across the quad.
I keep thinking about Arthur, Eleanor said, standing up in that room today. 10 years of silence, and he just stood up and said it plain as anything. It took courage, Vivian said. It took courage from all of us eventually, Eleanor said.
Took a long time getting there in my case. Too long, honestly. I should have stood beside him 10 years ago when it might have actually saved his career instead of just restoring his name after the fact.
You stood beside him today, Vivian said gently. That mattered too. Maybe more than you realize.
Eleanor gave a small, tired smile. You know, when you first arrived here, I remember thinking you seemed like someone carrying something heavy. Didn't know what it was. Didn't feel right asking.
I wasn't ready to tell anyone yet, Vivian admitted.
Some things need the right moment.
Well, Eleanor said, I'm glad the moment finally came. This campus needed it. More than most of us understood until today.
They stood together for a moment in the quiet evening light, two women who had barely known each other a month earlier, now bound by something that felt considerably stronger than simple friendship.
Come by for dinner Sunday, Eleanor said finally. I make a decent pot roast and I think we could both use an ordinary evening after a week like this one.
Vivian smiled, something easing gently in her chest.
I'd like that, she said.
Vivian's contract was not only reinstated, the board, in an unusual move, extended her an offer for a permanent teaching position, along with a formal public apology for how the entire matter had initially been handled. She accepted the teaching position. She accepted the apology, more quietly, understanding the way she always had that some wounds take longer to heal than a single ceremony can manage. Arthur Lowry received his own apology as well, delivered in a small private ceremony nearly a month later. The board voted to formally reinstate his name to the faculty honor records, correcting a decade-old injustice that had sat quietly, wrongly, in the shadows for far too long. A small plaque was commissioned for the economics building, honoring his 20 years of service, the true circumstances of his departure finally, properly acknowledged. Arthur stood before it on the day of its unveiling, Jo beside him, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. I never thought I'd see this day, he said quietly, more to Jo than to the small gathering assembled around them. 10 years. I told myself it didn't matter anymore, that the truth wasn't worth chasing at my age. It mattered, Jo said. It always mattered. He nodded, eyes glistening slightly in the afternoon light. Your father would be proud of you, he said, more than you'll ever fully understand. Vivian placed the medal in the college's small honor display case herself, at the administration's request, alongside a short written account of her service and the promise that had ultimately brought her to Millbrook. She hesitated before doing it, some old instinct still preferring quiet over recognition. But she thought of Daniel and of every promise ever made in places most people never had to survive, and she understood that some stories deserved to be told, not for the sake of the person who lived them, but for everyone who needed to hear that keeping your word still mattered, even when it cost something significant to do it. The medal sat now beside Arthur Lowry's new plaque, two small pieces of quiet honor finally given the light they'd always deserved. Jo herself changed in ways that went beyond the courtroom victory that had restored her grandfather's name. She joined the campus newspaper that semester, something she never would have considered before writing her first piece about the importance of academic integrity systems and how easily they could be misused without proper oversight. She didn't mention her own case directly. She didn't need to. Everyone on campus already knew. She visited Vivian's office hours regularly, not just for help with coursework, but simply to talk. About her father sometimes, piecing together a picture of him from Vivian's careful, honest memories. About her grandfather and the quiet grief he'd carried for a decade that finally had somewhere real to go. About her own future, which had started for the first time in a long while to feel like something worth planning carefully instead of simply enduring. I used to think being strong meant not needing anybody, Jo told Vivian one afternoon, sitting across from her in the quiet history office. I'm starting to think it might mean something closer to knowing exactly who you can lean on and letting yourself do it. That's about as close to the truth as I've ever heard anyone put it, Vivian said. On a warm afternoon several weeks later, Vivian stood at the front of room 214, watching her students file in for what had become, without her quite planning it, one of the most requested history sections on campus. Jo sat in her usual seat near the front now, instead of hiding in the middle rows. Grayson's seat sat empty, his suspension still in effect, though word had reached Vivian through Walter that the boy had been showing up faithfully to his mandated community service, quiet and changed in ways nobody had fully expected. Change, Vivian understood, rarely arrived all at once. It arrived slowly, in small, consistent choices, the same way courage did. She began class that day the way she began most classes now, with a brief pause before diving into the material, a moment to let the room settle. Today, she said, we're going to talk about what it actually means to stand up for something. Not the version you see in movies, the real version. Quiet, costly, often unrewarded, at least at first. She looked out at her students, at Jo's steady attention, at the empty seat that would eventually, hopefully, be filled again by someone genuinely changed. History isn't really made by the loudest people in the room, she said. It's made by the ones who refuse to stay quiet when silence would have been so much easier. Grayson Whitfield's community service placement, arranged as part of his suspension conditions, put him to work at a small veteran support center on the edge of town 3 afternoons a week. He hated it at first, resented every hour of it in the particular way 19-year-olds resent anything that forces them to sit still with discomfort instead of avoiding it. He stacked chairs, he organized donated clothing, he mostly stayed quiet, unsure how to be around men and women who had lived through things his sheltered life had never once required of him. Slowly, though, something began to shift. An older veteran named Frank, missing most of his left hand, took a liking to the sullen boy nobody else seemed to want around. He started talking to Grayson while they worked. Easy conversation about nothing important at first, baseball scores and weather and the terrible coffee the center always seemed to have on hand. Eventually, the conversations went deeper. "You know why I come here every week?" Frank asked him one afternoon. "Even though my service ended 30 years ago?" Grayson shrugged, uncertain. "Because the hardest thing I ever learned in uniform wasn't how to fight," Frank said. "It was how to admit when I was wrong, fast, before pride made the mistake bigger than it needed to be. Took me most of my 20s to learn that lesson properly. You're getting a head start, if you let yourself." Grayson thought about that conversation for a long time afterward. He thought about Vivian and the calm way she had absorbed his cruelty without ever once needing to return it. He thought about Jo and the tired, careful forgiveness she'd offered him in that boardroom, more grace than he'd honestly expected or fully deserved. He thought, too, about a small leather notebook he'd once thrown carelessly to the floor just to watch someone flinch. He hadn't understood back then that the smallest cruelties were often the ones people carried longest. He understood it now. He wrote her a proper letter, eventually, longer and more thoughtful than the hasty apology he'd stumbled through during the hearing. He didn't ask for anything in return. He simply said what needed saying plainly without excuses. Jo never responded in writing, but the next time their paths crossed on campus months later, she gave him a small, genuine nod instead of looking away. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, not yet. But it was something honest, built slowly out of real accountability instead of empty words. Sometimes that has to be enough to start with. That evening, Vivian sat once more by her window, the old leather notebook open on the table beside her, Daniel's photograph resting where the last of the daylight could catch it gently. "I kept it," she said quietly. "I kept my word." The room stayed silent around her the way it always did, though the silence felt different now. Lighter. Less like a debt still owed and more like a chapter finally, properly closed. Outside, Millbrook settled into another quiet evening, though the town itself had changed in ways it would take years to fully understand. A community that had learned slowly and painfully that looking away from injustice never actually made it disappear. It only let it grow quietly until someone finally arrived, brave enough, patient enough, to make it impossible to ignore any longer.
Vivian closed the notebook gently, the way she always did, and allowed herself at last a full and easy breath. She thought about all the small moments that had led here. A cup of black coffee at a diner counter weeks ago now, when Millbrook had still felt like nothing more than a quiet place to start over. A shove in a classroom that had briefly unfairly made her the subject of unkind gossip. A girl's trembling hands holding a notebook someone had tried to humiliate her with. Each of those moments had felt small at the time, isolated, unconnected to anything larger than the immediate discomfort of the day. Looking back now, she understood they'd never been small at all. They'd simply been the early quiet steps of a promise, finally, patiently working its way toward completion. She hadn't come to Millbrook looking for peace. She'd come looking to keep a promise. She found in the end that she'd somehow managed to find both. Millbrook itself began to change too, in small ways that most people only noticed if they'd been paying attention long enough to remember what came before. The college established a new oversight committee within the semester, independent from board influence, specifically designed to review conduct complaints from students and faculty without the risk of institutional interests quietly burying inconvenient truths. Eleanor volunteered to chair it, finally putting her decade of regret to productive use. The scholarship fund Arthur Lowry had once questioned was restructured entirely, placed under strict independent audit, the recovered funds redirected exactly where they'd always been meant to go. 3 new need-based scholarships were established that spring, quietly named in Arthur's honor, though he insisted characteristically on keeping the announcement modest. Walter received a small commendation from the college for his role in uncovering the truth, though he waved off most of the attention with the same steady humility he brought to everything else. He kept walking his rounds each evening, flashlight in hand, watching over the campus the same way he always had, though a few more students made a point of stopping to say hello these days. Sam kept his job in IT and found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, developing a genuine passion for data integrity work. He eventually helped design new safeguards for the college's backup systems, ones considerably harder for anyone to quietly tamper with in the future. None of it undid the harm that had already been done, but each small change made the next injustice, whenever it eventually arrived, just a little bit harder to hide. Preston Whitfield's story did not end quite as neatly as some in town might have wished, the kind of tidy justice storybooks promise, but real life rarely delivers in full. The independent review substantiated the misuse of scholarship funds, resulting in a formal settlement requiring restitution, along with a permanent ban from any future involvement with Millbrook College in any official capacity. Criminal charges were considered, but ultimately not pursued, the statute of limitations and the complexity of proving intent making prosecution difficult after so many years. He kept his house on the north edge of town. He kept most of his business interests. But the quiet, comfortable power he'd wielded for decades, the kind that let him bend institutions to his convenience without consequence, that was gone for good. Some people in Millbrook still greeted him politely on the street, old habits and old loyalties dying slowly. Others crossed to the other side, unwilling to extend even that small courtesy anymore. Preston rarely spoke about the matter publicly, but those who knew him well enough to notice such things said he seemed, in the months that followed, like a man who had finally, belatedly, begun to understand that some debts eventually come due, no matter how long you manage to postpone them. Whether that understanding ever deepened into genuine remorse, nobody could say for certain. Some men take a lifetime to learn a lesson their own children managed to learn in a single difficult season. Grayson at least seemed determined not to become his father. Some stories end with a battle won. This one ends somewhere quieter, with an old professor's name restored to a wall where it always belonged. With a young woman learning slowly that she came from a father who never stopped fighting for the people he loved. With a boy who slapped his teacher out of fear and pride, learning painfully that real strength looks nothing like what he'd always believed. And with a woman who had spent 12 years learning to stay calm in the face of danger, finally understanding that the bravest thing she'd ever done wasn't anything she did overseas.
It was walking into a small town alone and refusing to stay silent when silence would have been so much easier. If there's one thing worth carrying away from a story like this, let it be this. Kindness isn't weakness. Patience isn't surrender. And the quietest person in the room is sometimes the only one strong enough to finally set things right. Consider the people in your own life who carry more than they let on. The quiet neighbor, the soft-spoken coworker, the relative who never talks much about the years before you knew them. You may never learn their full story. That's all right. What matters is remembering that everyone carries something, and treating each person you meet with the kind of patience you'd want extended to you if your own hardest years were ever laid bare in a room full of strangers. That, more than any single twist in this story, is the lesson worth carrying forward. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs the reminder today. Sometimes the strongest people in our lives are the ones we never fully see coming.